Welcome to this episode of The Wolf and the Shepherd. Today we're going to be talking about witches and gingers. And since the wolf is now finally back from his holiday, he's done a little bit of research and he said, we need to talk about witches and gingers.
Hi, glad to be back. I know today sounds like a very controversial topic, witches and gingers.
Oh, especially so close to Halloween.
Well, actually why this topic is particularly controversial is this is the one time we have actually done some research.
Oh, we did actually look some stuff up this time.
Well, you'd think that episode we did about things we never saw coming, which was mainly based around technology, social media, you would have thought for one episode where it would have been good if we had actually bothered fact-checking something, that would have been the one.
That would have been the way that we should have done it, yes.
Yeah, but instead I've spent a few hours looking up witches and gingers.
Time well spent.
It is well spent. Originally, I intended this to be two separate topics, but I didn't know if even you or I could BS enough to actually fill out a podcast talking about what we actually knew about witches and gingers. But there are, in terms of treatment of both groups, a lot of similarities through history. Most of the witch stuff I kind of knew about in terms of them being burnt at the stake.
Right.
But gingers have had it bad for about 4,000 years.
No kidding.
Yep.
4,000 years. That's crazy. So lead us up to it. Get us started here.
Well, we pretty much know, or at least most people have, a somewhat, I guess, filtered version of where witches came from,
Right.
witches' role in history. But the ginger has kind of slipped under the radar, which is quite ironic because when you look at them physically, they don't slip under the radar. And this has been their biggest problem through our history.
That's true. I mean, you could hide the fact that you are a witch, but you can't hide the fact that you're a ginger.
Right.
And this might be early in the podcast to bring it up, but you got the Harry Potter books and you got the Weasleys who were gingers and witches. You know, they could probably hide the fact that they were, not wizards or witches or whatever, but they couldn't hide the fact that they were gingers.
Right. And that actually brings me to a funny story because one of obviously the main characters in Harry Potter is Ginger, and obviously then you've got Harry Potter and then the girl, whatever her name is, Hermione, whatever.
Yeah, Hermione.
Anyway,
yeah.
One of the first reviews I read on the original Harry Potter movie was from a guy, I think, from Empire magazine.
Okay.
And, he went through the synopsis of the whole movie. He said, the only thing I found really unbelievable in this movie is that there's a ginger kid with two friends.
Absolutely. That is so true. And of course, those friends were kind of forced on him. I barely remember that first movie. It's been years since I've seen any of the Harry Potter movies. But I do remember them being on that train, and he didn't have a friend on that train. But of course, Harry Potter didn't have a friend either. And it was like, well, I feel sorry for you, little ginger boy. I'll be your friend because nobody else is my friend. But I guess the only friends he could get was kids that lived under the stairs in their, what was it, uncle and aunt or something like that, cousin. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it wasn't even with his parents. So he's a little orphan boy that was living under the stairs, and that's the only friend the ginger kid could get.
Right. Well, I just want to clarify, actually, for our American listeners, when we say ginger, we don't mean redhead.
See, that's the way it's kind of taken in the United States.
Yeah. You see, redheads, it can be kind of like an offshoot of a brunette, somebody who's got some almost like chestnut dye in their hair.
Okay.
That's a redhead. There's a very big difference between ginger and a redhead. You know when you see a ginger. If you have to look at somebody and wonder if they're a ginger, they're not a ginger.
Okay, so then over in the UK, that is used much different than in the US. So give me a famous ginger, whether it's a US person, UK person. If you were having to explain to somebody that never heard the term ginger before, and you had to say, well, so-and-so, that is a ginger, who would that person be?
Well, I was actually going to say Emperor Nero and also Napoleon, but I get that they're not great reference points for most people, as
right.
all the images that exist of them are all hand drawn, so not the best example. But I would say over here, Carrot Top, that kind of weird kind of comedian. If you
Right.
can
So
say
so
that,
so
dude.
you're looking at somebody that, of course, has the red hair,
Yeah,
right? But then kind of is a little bit funny looking. You don't quite know why they're funny looking.
Yeah.
You just know they're funny
Sure,
looking.
yeah.
Maybe kind of the very light skin, lots of freckles, that kind of deal.
Yeah.
Is that ginger person?
Yeah, and I think the gingers were demonized more in England than here in the United States, but I think that's because we had several centuries to kind of perfect the art of demonizing them, really.
Yeah.
But they were, as I mentioned earlier, gingers have been persecuted for thousands and thousands of years.
Okay, walk us through that.
Well, I mean, for one, the reason gingers get singled out is because it's a genetic mutation which affects roughly about 1 and 2% of the population.
Okay.
And so throughout history, they've always stood out. And any ethnicity can actually result in that mutated gene to have red hair. So no ethnicity is safe from being a ginger.
Okay.
And you can imagine some of those combinations would actually bring up even more prejudice than exists in certain places.
I can totally see that.
Yeah, but gingers in medieval Europe were punished pretty much the same way as witches before the whole "let's kill the witches" thing came in, and they were put in stocks, which these kind of wooden entraptions which they put in the town center.
Yeah, they put their head through the little hole, and then they had the wrists on either side through the hole, and in the townspeople, whether they were peasants or anybody else, went by, and they could yell at them, make fun of them, throw spoiled fruit at them, or spoiled food for that matter, waste, garbage, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
And those stocks were carried over into the quote unquote new world. At the turn of 200-300 years ago, because that was a form of punishment. Now, I guess protected by the Constitution as something that would be cruel and unusual, but it was common.
Right.
That was a common punishment.
Yeah, and actually, I was thinking about that idea the other day about the stocks when I came up with the topic of witches and gingers, and I was wondering if there were any type of rules involving the distance you're able to throw the rotten vegetables at their face from, because if there was a 12-foot line, maybe being hit by a mushy carrot probably wouldn't hurt that much.
Right.
But if they're allowed to throw kind of like a 9-pound potato at your face from about 4 inches away, I think that's where it crosses past the line of not being funny anymore.
Yeah. I can only picture things that I've seen in the movies.
Yeah.
And you see the throwing of the rotten vegetables and the rotten food and everything at them in the movies, but you also see like little kids walking right up to them and slapping them in the head and slapping them in the face, and the crowd cheers because they're doing that. So there's always been that aspect of it as well, as far as what happens to somebody in the stocks. I think most of the time you were sentenced to a certain amount of time to sit in those stocks, and it was originally just supposed to be painful for you to just have to sit there for that long.
Yeah, most of the ones I've seen are where you stand up in them and you kind of bent over at 90 degrees. And, one never talked about those stocks. The worst thing that happened was when the sun went down. People used to take advantage of the lack of light and the opportunity. And let's just say if you were in the stocks because you committed adultery, but you didn't really commit adultery, by the end of the night, you had committed adultery.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a safe way to put it. I think everybody gets the gist of that.
Right. Quick question.
Sure.
Name me a really nasty person in history.
Oh, gosh. The immediate one that comes to mind that is kind of a given, most people are probably thinking the same thing, have to be Adolf Hitler.
Right. So as bad as you can imagine him to be,
Right.
even he had a prejudice against gingers.
Well, among his other many prejudices.
Well, yeah,
right?
but this is one of those things that most people would always be, do you have anything in common with Hitler? And, you know, obviously the answer is going to be, no, I can't think of anything, personality traits. But even he hated gingers, and he actually banned the marriage between gingers. And this was so because both the mother and the father need to have the mutated gene to pass on, and it can lay dormant. It can skip generations, but he actually banned the marriage of ginger people so that he could try and kill out that strain, because he was into eugenics anyway.
Right.
But even the gingers didn't escape.
Now, when you're saying ban the marriage of gingers, you mean like two ginger people marrying each other, or just one random ginger person?
Two ginger people.
Okay. So that was kind of looked at as, hey, there's a strong possibility that their offspring right here is going to be able to carry this recessive gene. And so we want to make sure that we can kind of weed this out over time.
I think there was an assumption there that, people didn't have sex outside of marriage because, he could have just banned sex between gingers and, it would have had the same effect.
But we are talking about a long time ago.
Yeah.
So it makes more sense. If you'd have someone like a Hitler today, then yes, you'd probably have some kind of rule that would say that sex would be illegal, or having a child between two gingers would be illegal, something along those lines.
Well, actually, I think it was in an Australian scientific magazine. There's a group of scientists who believe that gingers are going to be extinct within 100 years, or even as soon as 2060.
Wow.
Which is bad news for anybody born roughly about now, because you're going to go extinct.
Yeah. And is that just because of that recessive trait being so recessive and things getting a little more mixed up with the gene pool, that eventually that little, tidbit of genetics is just going to eventually get wiped away?
Well, there was actually some positivity to the mutation when it first appeared in humans.
Okay.
That it would allow, because ginger people have fewer layers of skin, their enamel on their teeth is thinner, which is why a lot of ginger people look like they've got yellow teeth. They can't really do much about that. I mean, talk about just inheriting a whole ton of bad stuff. Well, anyway, there used to actually be an advantage of being ginger in certain climates, because the lighter your skin, the more sensitive it made you to, the sun. But it's the opposite when they go to areas, like Northern Europe, where there's not necessarily that much sun, because that skin could then actually absorb more vitamin D from what little sun there was, and so it was actually a benefit. But the gene has actually mutated so much over the years that now that same strand of DNA which caused that effect actually completely changed it to now gingers are something like 12 times as likely to get skin cancer and about 50 times quicker to get sunburnt. So that went downhill kind of across.
I would have to imagine that span of the gingers or whatever had to exist more in places where you had a lot of cloud cover or whatever. Like you said, you had that advantage where if it's cloudy, like you say, Northern Europe, I'm thinking, in the United States, you'd look at somewhere like the Pacific Northwest, kind of that same thing. It's always cloudy all the time, so you want to somehow have that absorption of vitamin D. And so I could see if you were, looking for somewhere to live, you wouldn't want to go to, say, Phoenix, Arizona, where the sun is out every day, or Los Angeles, California, because, like you say, then you're just going to have to rub sunscreen all over yourself and get burned all the time.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I did actually find quite a lot of similarities or connections between witches and gingers when I was doing my research. As I said, that they were both put in stocks, in the middle of the town. Generally, in some cultures, if you have ginger hair, they assume you're a witch, and they kill you. That happens actually now in some countries in Africa.
Yeah, so not that they treat gingers and witches the same. It's just using that linear logic. You're a ginger, therefore you're a witch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's like, if she weighs the same as a duck, she's made of wood, therefore she's a witch, and we get to burn her. Almost that same kind of theory.
Right. And and this is, I guess, where the kind of witches and the gingers do separate slightly, is that at least with a witch, you had a trial. Even if they decided you were guilty before the trial even existed, at least you had a trial. When you're a ginger, that's it. Like you said earlier, you can't hide it.
Right.
And so, if you were a girl, especially with ginger hair, then there's not much you could do to escape the thought that people are going to think you're a witch.
That's hilarious, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it really does. If you look down the line and you think about it, the prejudices and everything that we've had as communities, societies over the years, the centuries, the millennia, however you want to pose that, there's always been something about, hey, those people are a little bit different than I am.
Yeah,
and almost kind of the same with the witches.
Right.
There were a lot of people that probably were burned at the stake or executed or whatever that weren't witches. But let's be honest, there probably were some that were legitimate witches that went to trial and were actually witches and found guilty. We look at it today and say, well, okay, not that really big of a deal. But back then, pretty big deal.
Yeah. And I think with witches, the whole idea around them has been romanticized, probably mostly because of the Halloween thing. I mean, they're a baddie, but they're kind of, it doesn't mean you dress up as a witch or whatever.
And it has been romanticized. I mean, think about now, and here's one I'll throw at you and see if this would fit your definition, so to speak, of a ginger.
Right.
I remember the movie Practical Magic with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman.
Right.
And Nicole Kidman's got the red hair. I don't know if that would be ginger
then
or
it's not, ginger.
Not, but that movie, part of the point of that whole movie is, these women and their aunts or whatever it was, they were legitimate witches, legitimately possessed this magic and all of this stuff. But at the end of the movie, it was, hey, we're okay. We're not bad people. We're not evil. We just try to help everybody. And even though throughout the whole movie they were persecuted against, and the one that Sandra Bullock plays, she swore off magic and didn't want to do any magic. And then at the end, you have that hooray moment where the whole town comes out and watches them jump off the roof and ride their brooms and all that stuff. And so, like you say, the whole romanticized part. You've got the sexy witch costume, right? And that's okay. It's not the scraggly nose and the green skin. It's not the Wicked Witch of the West, which if you look at The Wizard of Oz, there's another example, because if you remember, Dorothy in the movie even says to the Witch of the East, whatever it is, Glinda, she's in the pretty like prom dress and everything, and Dorothy says, well, you don't look like a witch. So it's almost been going on subliminally for quite a while that witches aren't all bad.
Right.
Right? They're not all bad, but you still have that little section of the bad witches.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that romanticized label is probably the best thing you can attach to the whole witch imagery in today's society, because very little is actually known about witches. If you ask the majority of people, what is witchcraft? Is it just about doing magic? Is it based upon a religion, or is it based upon an absence of religion? And
do you wear a pointy hat? Do you have a black cat?
Yeah,
do you have a
exactly.
cauldron that you stir up potions in, or is there something more to it?
Right. Yeah. And so there's a lot of mistaken imagery and history to witches, which people just, you know, what little, I guess, information they do find out factually about witches is quickly kind of erased and overtaken by the images and, you know, cartoons and Halloween things. But I mean, witches have been persecuted throughout history. I mean, the earliest, I guess, in terms of what is relevant to us, mention of a witch is in Exodus 22, where it says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live."
Ah.
Now, I had a thought about that, right? If I was a witch, and when that, I think that was the New King James translation.
Sure.
You know, if you're a witch, you're kind of, I wish they'd hurry up and rewrite another version of the Bible, because that sentence sounds pretty harsh.
Right. And,
you know?
and of course, you're talking about Exodus, so you're talking about the early parts of the Jewish tradition,
right.
the writing of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible being the Torah and everything. So, so you're talking about, you know, the beginning of what we consider as kind of recorded history of going through there. So we're talking about that stuff in the Bible. So I think a lot of people, once you say the term witch, especially in the United States, the first thing that comes to mind is the Salem witch trials.
Right.
You know, so you say, well, what do you know about witches? And you get past the hat and the cat and the cauldron and all that. The next click is Salem. And what happened during the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, and again, you know, the Salem witch trials, I bet most people would think, wow, how long did that last for? Maybe 10 years, 15 years. It basically went across a 2-year period.
Right.
Which really surprised me. I mean,
very little snippet in history as far as time-wise goes, but so blatantly taught, repeated. You know, everybody knows the Salem witches and the Salem witch trial. It's in American history books. It made that cut. There are so many things that lasted for more years than that get left out of the history books, but the Salem witch trials, they always make it.
And I think a lot of people, you know, assume, along with the, you know, it lasted way longer than it actually did, is that it involved probably more witch instances than it actually did. I thought, you know, they'd rounded up thousands across, you know, multiple towns up there in Massachusetts. But the reality is there was only about 100 people charged with witchcraft.
Right.
And I think they found roughly about 30 were found guilty witchcraft, and they hung 19 of them. Whereas again, if you'd have asked me before I looked it up, how many witches did they, you know, burn at the stake, I would have literally said in the thousands and thousands.
Oh, yeah, you and I both. That would have been just something that always was going on in Salem, and it was like, oh, well, it's Tuesday. What do we got going on today? Well, we're going to go down to the market. We're going to get some bread. We're going to get some vegetables, and then we're going to stop by the witch burning today.
Right.
And that was a day in the life of Salem for years.
And that period is actually nothing compared to like the Spanish Inquisition, which went on for a long, long time and burnt a lot of witches, and they also...
And by the way, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Right, exactly. That is true.
Who knew we were going to talk so much Monty Python during this one?
But they also had the belief that ginger-headed people were witches, and so would burn people with ginger hair as well. I mean, I didn't know that, but that's something else they have. And that
was part of the Spanish Inquisition, is what you're saying. So they were looking at a lot of different stuff during the Spanish Inquisition, the heretics and all that good stuff. But yes, part of that, of course, was the witches. But it was one of those, what you're saying then is, there's a ginger equals witch. Witch equals...
It's a two for one.
That makes it easy. We don't even have to put you through a trial.
Right.
You know, we know you're guilty. So, it makes it easy for them.
Right. And the witch hunts in Europe actually went on for 300 years, from 1450 right through 1750, and there were still cases after that. I think it was 1972 in England. was the last time somebody went to court for practicing witchcraft. Somebody, and I don't know what they were doing. Maybe that was the issue rather than the ideology. It's, but no, somebody was actually prosecuted for practice of witchcraft. But what they were practicing, might make all the difference.
But what you're telling me though is there were still laws on the books against witchcraft over there, and
until
up until 1972, that stuff was going on. That's just crazy to think about. I mean, it really is. I say it's crazy to think about, but in today's day and age, honestly, nothing surprises me that much anymore. So that right there doesn't even surprise me. There's probably some, we'll call them third world country, right, that probably is still prosecuting at some level witches, whether it be in formal court or informal court in some village somewhere.
Oh, they put them to death now in places like Nigeria.
Right.
If you're convicted of being a witch, they can put you to death.
That'd be an interesting trial to attend.
Right, yeah, that would be. And as you know, going back to the Salem witch trials, most people, I think, mistakenly think it was a bunch of sex-crazed old men, rejected internally because they can't, be with these attractive young women, suddenly purge them from society. But the truth is, the Salem witch trials started because a bunch of young girls started acting hysterical, and they claimed they were possessed by the devil. And they accused, I don't know whether it was women just within their own village or within the church or whatever, of being witches. And that's how it all rolled off.
So the accusations were out there. People were, saying, hey, you're a witch. So how were they figuring out, in their estimation, whether or not somebody really was a witch? Back off the ginger thing, because that was just supposed to be automatic. So now a regular looking person, right? They're not wearing the pointy hat. They don't have a black hat on, or black cat, and they don't have their cauldron, all that good stuff. How were they being tested? How were they being proved in these courts that they were a witch?
Well, given for how many hundreds of years ago this was, I think they actually came up with some pretty sensible methods to test, and pretty much foolproof, which I think is why, out of all the witches they convicted, that only a fifth of them were put to death. So I mean, I think it was, I think they had their game straight when it came down to their tests. One of the tests would be that the prospective witch would be blindfolded, and they'd spin her around a few times, and a man in front of them would be holding a crucifix or a Bible and a dagger in the other hand. And the witch was supposed to put her hand out and point to where she thought the crucifix or the Bible was. And if she pointed to the dagger, it was proof that she loved Satan and was in cohorts with Satan. Now, if she actually got the right answer, the court could decide that she could have to redo it 2 more times.
Right.
Just to ensure they get the
kind of like if you and I are trying to decide who has to go on the next beer run,
right?
And I said, well, let's flip a coin. It comes up tails. I'm like, best 2 out of 3.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. There were other tests they do. I mean, actually, burning at the stake could sometimes be used as a test to see if you're a witch. Because if you didn't burn, then you were a witch. But if you did burn, you weren't a witch.
Oh, how convenient for witches!
Right. Yeah. And there's other ones where they would tie them to a plank of wood and dunk it in the river and hold her under the water for 4 or 5 minutes. If she drowned, she wasn't a witch. If she came back up and she was alive, that meant she was a witch, and then she got burnt at the stake. So
but if she was a witch and then got burned at the stake and still was a witch and didn't burn at the stake, almost sounds like the tests were more towards the benefit of the witch and not of the non-witch. Because if if the tests were fatal to the non-witches, but the witches could survive, how did somebody not sit back and say, you know what, Bob, maybe we need to rethink some of these tests here because we're killing a lot of people and finding out that they're not actually witches.
Right.
And all the witches are surviving. What are we supposed to do? And he's like, well, I don't know, Steve. We got to come up with something better. Oh, I know, dunk them in the river. Yeah, let's start dunking them in the river.
Right, yeah. Yes, I mean, it was it could be very brutal, across that 300-year period in Europe. And, during the period in the States here, it could be a very brutal time to be accused of something which, today, witches are pretty much everywhere. Their numbers have grown exponentially. You've even got famous witches like Lana Del Rey, the musician.
Oh, okay. Didn't know that.
Yeah. I kind of have a few doubts about her powers because the second and third album absolutely sucked.
Well, yeah. I can't honestly tell you that I'm a Lana Del Rey fan. I couldn't name a song by her right now. I'm not saying she's not a good artist, but you talk about some of the stuff that kind of came up recently. What about the whole Wiccan part of it? Because I know when some people hear the term witch, or I think what the male version is warlock or wizard or something like that.
Let me interrupt you there. That's actually not true. A warlock is not a male witch. A warlock used to be somebody who was a witch, but to spare their own life, they would give up the names of the other witches, and that's where the name warlock comes from. So, and I guess that's why it rhymes with narc.
Right. So there you go. So talk a little bit about the Wiccans and where all that kind of came about. And I think what we're talking about a little less than 100 years ago, something like that, right?
Yeah, I think people get Wicca and pagan mixed up, or they think it means the same thing, and it really doesn't. Wicca, or the Wiccan kind of religion, has only been around since the 40s, and I don't know whether it is a marketing ploy, but their principal belief is do no harm. And so when you talk about Wiccans, people sometimes put them too far into the witch category when they're not kind of there. They follow some of the same principles, the belief in utilizing nature's magic. But Wiccan, it isn't where witchcraft comes from. Witchcraft is actually a pagan religion, and the pagans has been a whole bunch of religions come out of paganism, and witchcraft just happened to be one of them, and that's really the more accurate version of what you would call witchcraft, even though Wiccans do use earth magic the same as they're doing witchcraft. So it's
the Wiccans sometimes get looked at as kind of the earthy people. They want to go out there and celebrate like the solstice, and it's more of kind of a Mother Nature leaning thought. I could see how a lot of people might get the Druids and the Wiccans a little bit mixed up. Don't know if there's a connection with the Druids and witchcraft. There probably is. I haven't dug into that all that much by any means whatsoever.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on, I can't remember what exactly we were talking about, but about a witch riding a broom, and I think that might have been when we were talking about the romanticism of witches.
Yeah, well, that was so you always have that broom thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one of those stereotypical categories.
Yeah.
So once again, in the Harry Potter movies, they play Quidditch and they're all riding the brooms, right? Or you have the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, and she's on a broom. And then in the Practical Magic movie, they have the brooms and they use that. And so there was always this attachment to brooms. And in fact, even in today's day and age, you see a broom laying there and like, oh, hey, that you parked your ride over there to a woman, and then she gets all mad once she figures out you're trying to call her a witch, right?
Right.
So there's always been this attachment to brooms. So let's talk about that a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
where did that come from?
Well, again, because it's a romanticized image, and very much part of Halloween, which is on broomsticks. A number of years ago, I did actually take the trouble to find out where it originated, and real witches used to use the extract of the belladonna plant to put themselves into trance-like states.
So was it like a hallucinogenic?
Yeah, yeah, very, very strong one. But the problem with ingesting it was that it had such a bitter taste that the majority of the time you would throw up, so it never got to metabolize in your gut, and so failed to have the desired effect. And so they had to find another way to get the belladonna extract into the body. And given that God gave us 3 holes, they chose the one which was not the mouth.
Right.
And so they would coat a broomstick, the end of a broomstick, with the belladonna extract, and then push it into themselves. And that's where the witches ride a broom actually comes from.
That's... I can honestly say I was not expecting that explanation, but you know what? I'm going to go back to the nothing else shocks me anymore. So not really surprised that it had something to do with that. And of course, I can't picture gingers wanting to do that, but you know, I can't also picture witches wanting to do that.
Right.
Either. Just, wow, crazy. Absolutely crazy. But at least we took that broom thing and cleaned that up a bit and made it to where now they just ride them around and all that good stuff, and it's not so dirty anymore.
Right, sure. So really, in summary, I think what we have proven is that gingers have had it as bad, if not worse, than witches. In ancient Egypt, I think they would actually bury ginger people alive as a sacrifice to a god called Osiris or something.
If you think about something like ancient Egypt, right, and you're talking about northern Africa, would there have been, and this is, by the way, total speculation here, but would there have been a correlation with an albino maybe being lumped in the same category as a ginger?
No, like I said before, if you question whether they're a ginger or not, they're not a ginger. You know when you see a ginger. It's just one of those things where you're kind of,
But you could argue the fact that if you look at an albino, you could say, well, they don't look like a ginger, let's say, but maybe they carry those same characteristics. Maybe all albinos are witches too, and anybody that doesn't look like me is a witch. Anybody that doesn't root for the same football team as me is a witch. Right. Crazy things like that.
Well, I think albinos, it's actually the opposite in nature. I mean, certainly with man, we kind of, albino species of animals, or rather kind of sudden mutations, are treated very religiously,
That's a good point.
Especially in India. And so that mutation, like with an albino, is actually treated very positively. But the ginger, there is no, and I spent a good amount of time, but I could not find one positive trait attributed to gingers throughout history. It's been persecution from start to finish.
So you talk about, persecution start to finish all the way through. I mean, I think we've hit quite a bit of different development in societies. Were there any other kind of historical societies that were a little more developed that had something against them?
Yeah, I mean, Greece,
really?
Well, you see, Greece was a generally, very liberal type place in terms of hedonistic
Well,
you know.
right, and of course that's
Yeah.
the birthplace of philosophy.
Yeah.
And you got a bunch of people sitting around talking about stuff.
Yeah.
And pretty much like we're doing right now.
Right.
You know,
But they were very accepting of
the
everybody.
Greeks were the
you know.
first podcasters,
Yeah.
right? They just didn't have
Yeah.
the internet to be able to do their podcast.
Yeah, but I mean, they were renowned for being very welcoming, accepting of everything, every type of sexual deviation, any type of lifestyle. But they believed that gingers turned into vampires after they died.
Wow.
You know, and you think of all the Greek philosophers, all these brilliant texts written, this existential stuff, and they come up with, see those gingers, they turn into vampires after they die.
Right.
Yeah.
Listen to all this philosophy. Here's the way you should live. Here's all this stuff they've really thought through, and then almost as a footnote. And oh yeah, you see those dudes over there? Yeah, they're going to be vampires when they die. Like, well, wait a second. All this stuff just made sense, but you're just making this random blanket statement that these dudes are going to become vampires. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
That's great. It just goes to show you how far we've come. But even today, I would be willing to bet, and I think it'd be a very safe bet, that witches are still persecuted against.
Yeah.
You know, we live at least in a society right now where we realize that there is no magic. They're not doing their little magic potions and all that. And even if they are, they're not really doing anything. Or I don't know, maybe they are, you know, I don't know, but your typical rational person is not going to sit there and think that they're able to do that. But gingers still exist, and maybe there's some reason why people point at gingers and still kind of discriminate against them, and there's that inborn thing, and they're not really sure why, but they do.
Right, and I'll end with this story. In England, as you know, a slang word for testicles is bollocks. Right? But, you know, bollocks doesn't always relate to talking about testicles. Sometimes you'll just say, oh, what a bunch of bollocks. You know, just something being derisory about
and
something.
also, isn't bollocks kind of, you know, you mess something up, right? And you say, oh, bollocks.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I remember when I was in either 5th or 6th grade, I was about maybe 12. We were in a PE class, and the PE teacher was going to pair us all off for this game we were about to play. And this kid walks in late, and the PE teacher points at him and says, "Oi, ginger bollocks, why are you late?"
Oh gosh, you couldn't get away with that anymore. That's for sure. But well, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of The Wolf and the Shepherd. We'll be back with some more interesting entertainment for you. We appreciate all the support that y'all have given us as we've been going through and creating these podcasts. So we hope that you'll share this with your friends and keep supporting us. And we'll catch you next time.